everybody. Welcome to this episode of Transplant Talks. I'm Rachel Davis, psychiatrist and living liver donor, and I'm here with my co-host Anastasia Henry, who's executive director of the American Transplant Foundation. And today we have the pleasure of talking with Dr. Sixto Giusti, and this is his second time on our podcast. We're going to talk about the fascinating topic of transplantation in the context of migration. But before we get into that, Sixto, can you tell us a little bit about your background and why you were interested in nephrology?
Of course, first of all, thank you for having me back. It's a great pleasure to be here and talk about this interesting topic. So initially, what reeled me in to nephrology or transplant nephrology was a combination of events. In college, I had took an immunology course, which I found fascinating. At the same time, my roommate, one of my best friends, had FSGS and required a transplant. So I saw the whole spectrum from him being super healthy at 20 years old to all of a sudden having a big change in his health and obviously not doing so well, and then being able to recover back his life with a living donor kidney transplant, which that definitely was one of the turning points. Then in med school, my favorite course in the first year was renal physiology. I was very driven or drawn to it by the complexity and how well it functioned. And then ultimately, my residency, internal medicine residency, my favorite mentor was on a project. So that was the icing on the cake. So that combination of factors led me to pursue a career in academic transplant nephrology.
Well, and what I didn't say in the beginning is that you're an associate professor of medicine at the University of Colorado Anschutz and also director of the Hispanic Transplant Clinic.
Yep, that's one of my uh, babies or passions as well that I like to do. And we have a very good team here tackling the healthcare disparity that Hispanics face in this country, and particularly when talking about kidney transplantation.
And I imagine that's a topic that probably will weave throughout our dialogue today.
Yes, ma'am.
So tell us why you want to talk about this topic, transplantation in the context of migration. First of all, what does that
So,
mean and why is it important?
as part of the role that we have with the Hispanic Transplant Program, we see a decent number of undocumented citizens that come into this country for work, mostly for work, and then for X or Y reason they end up in kidney failure. So most of these patients, before they were not able to receive any type of care and end up just either going back to their country of origin to just die or try to get some help there. So with the Hispanic Transplant Program, we try to help these patients that otherwise don't have like an alternative. With the provisions that the states put in place, the state of Colorado back in 2018 or 2019, some of these patients now are able to get dialysis and eventually transplant. So once that happened, we were able to help this patient population that was otherwise unattended or were not receiving the appropriate care. So that's my first connection to talking about undocumented citizens receiving organ transplantation. Uh, in, in last year, in 2024, Dr. Peter Scott, which is a transplant surgeon at the University of California in San Francisco, gave a talk about this same topic. So he was part of a group of leaders, which we'll talk about, that met back in 2022 to talk about the same topic about transplanting in the context of migration and refugees. So that talk definitely sparked more interest in me in trying to get to know more about the topic. And now I feel like I'm in a position to try to spread the word out and try to make sure that more people are aware of the findings and the things at play here. So.
I'm curious to hear a little bit more. Could you tell us before legislation was passed in, you said 2017 or 2018, what
Mhm.
was the status for people who are undocumented and in kidney failure? What did that look like for them?
So not so good. As you're aware, we have a friend in common, Dr. Cervantes, Lidia Cervantes. So she was the master of the one that spearhead that here in the state of Colorado, and she has the best example of what happened. She had a patient that she identified with, and that patient unfortunately didn't have insurance, and was just getting emergency dialysis on on regular basis, and unfortunately had to just go back to her country of origin to die. So they did not have many options, unfortunately.
Well, and just to clarify for our listeners who may not be aware of what emergency dialysis, it means basically someone has to wait until they're so sick that they're at risk of death before they can get dialysis. And before that legislation was passed, that's how people who were undocumented, that was the only way they could get dialysis. So that's a terrible way to live.
It's a terrible way to live. And also, like, let's talk about the cost of emergency dialysis.
Yes. So Dr. Cervantes has a very nice study that was published around 4 or 5 years ago, tackling the same topic. So first of all, as Dr. Davis was mentioning, it's not a good thing for patient from like mortality or quality of life perspective. Usually, standard in-center dialysis, patients go 3 times a week to get their treatment to a center outside of the emergency facility on a controlled scenario where they're more comfortable and they get adequate dialysis. This patient population that are uninsured and have kidney failure, as Dr. Davis said, they have to go to the emergency room and pray that they're very sick or even have to fake symptoms to be able to get the life-saving treatment of dialysis. That means a huge cost to the state, and that's something that people might not be aware of. So although, yes, we're talking about somebody who is undocumented, by providing regular dialysis to this patient population, we actually save money. And to the other perspective too, like we are improving the patient's quality of life and their life expectancy. And as we're going to talk about later, these are individuals that come here to work and are able to provide way more in terms of money to the economy than they take out. So it's, at least for me, having that information seems like a no-brainer, right, to help these patients.
Yeah, exactly. So just to clarify, like if a person, receiving regular dialysis treatment, they are able to work, not everything will be available, but there's still, like, we know police officers that are still working while on dialysis, or they can just have completely no resources to survive. And once they literally on the edge of dying, they get in this emergency dialysis. Like, it's just such a no-brainer. Can you go back for a second, Sixto, to that particular legislation? Was it just Colorado specific, or what was the name of it, or was it national? Can you tell us more about that?
In general, so what's the access of kidney care for undocumented immigrants across the United States? So we have a nice study from Dr. Isolo that was published in 2023, and that study looked at the whole landscape of that same question across the US. So as of 2023, there were 20 states and DC that provided statewide coverage for standard outpatient hemodialysis for undocumented immigrants. So these patients, if they meet certain criteria, including working and having lived in the States for X amount of years, they were able to be included in this, thanks to the 1972 Medicare ESRD program that tells us that U.S. citizens and lawfully present immigrant populations with access to care should be able to receive dialysis as well. So in terms of transplant, as of 2023, there were 5 states, including the state of Colorado, California, Massachusetts, that offer transplant access through like state funding. So obviously the nationwide coverage is still not accepted, but at least in there certain pockets and states that do have provisions through their own fund to try to offer these patients insurance so they can get dialysis and transplant.
So the legislation that passed was not only dialysis, but it extended to transplant, or was that a separate legislation?
It's not a legislation, it's an interpretation of the existing rule. So that was already put in place back in 1972. We were just, or like Dr. Cervantes was just smart about it, going through the trying to interpret the actual existing law differently. So, and this is something that is statewide. We don't use national funds, which is I think is the key. So we use state funds or statewide funds to allocate for this patient population.
Okay.
Do you have any statistics since that legislation? What are the trends? Like, are you seeing the difference just on a personal level? Somebody who grew up in Puerto Rico, like, what are you seeing?
So what we did, which we when that started after 2019 and forward, we see like a big pool of patients that were sitting 10 or plus years on dialysis, and now all of a sudden they were able to get transplanted. So we saw like a big bolus or a big number of patients, at least in our center, probably from the range of about 50 to 75 during those 2019 and 2020 period that were waiting on emergency dialysis. And once they were able to get insurance, they were able to get transplanted. And I still follow many of those patients, and they're doing great. They're citizens that are contributing, they're working, they're all happy, they're raising their families and contributing to the economy. So I think it's a great thing that we're able to do so. And we're going to talk about it later, but we have our own internal and national data that shows that these patients, in terms of outcome, they do better than any other population. So if given the opportunity, they're going to do great, thrive, and be able to continue contributing to our society. So
Why do you think they do better?
so it's a combination of there might be some selection bias, meaning that the patients that get through the transplant list or even get referred are usually younger and healthier. And one of the other theories is like all these sicker older individuals don't tend to go take the risk and migrate to another country looking for better opportunities. The vast majority are young, healthy individuals that are ready to work, and unfortunately get sick while being here and end up needing dialysis. So I think that's one of the key factors of why they do so well. There are other potential theories, including like, for example, Hispanics have like a big family niche, so they have like a strong family support to get them through it. Once they are able to trust or establish a rapport with the provider or the physician, they do very well, and they're very good patients in terms of like following instructions and doing what they ask them to. But I think that the main reason is what we are seeing: the patients that are actually getting to the transplant list are the cream of the crop or the healthiest of that subgroup. And that's why I think they're doing so well.
I want to ask you, Sixto, so were you the one who started Hispanic Transplant Program Initiative at the University of Colorado?
Say again?
Were you the one who started Hispanic Transplant Program?
The idea came about by Dr. Rafals and Dr. Elizabeth Pomfret. So both of them, they're no longer working here, but they met back in Boston. And Monica, which is from Puerto Rico, she's the one that recruited me to help with the Hispanic program. She noticed that need back in the hospital in Boston. And then when Dr. Pomfret came here and saw a bigger number of Hispanic in our population, got Monica here to kickstart the program. And then 2 years after, when the program kept growing, that's when they recruited me to try to help. And then they both ended up leaving, and I took the baton and took over.
How many transplant centers across the country have Hispanic transplant program or initiative?
So I said that the number is increasing. It's very hard to say because most of them will portray that they do have a Hispanic transplant program, but at the same time might not have the whole key components. But I said that at least half of the transplant programs now have some form of initiative of whether having interpreters with the information in Spanish or having most of the key pieces needed for you to call like a Hispanic transplant program per se. So the number is increasing.
Mm-hmm. I know that your program, your team, you very much focused on cultural education and also cultural education related to living donation. Mm-hmm. As I'm thinking about different cultures, I'm thinking like Eastern European culture. Mm-hmm. For so many people to ask to donate a kidney, it's basically like asking like, hey, can you give me like cut out your hand, right? Yeah. So can you talk about that? Like how can we address that?
So I think education is the key to success. In Hispanics, which I can foresee in other different cultures as well, the same, living donation is kind of a taboo. And if you ask a patient, 99% of the time from the get-go, they're going to say like, no, are you crazy? No, of course not. But once you start educating about what living donation entails, what are the actual risks to the donor, which in theory, if you have a healthy donor that qualifies, those risks are minimal. So when patients start understanding what is the actual risk versus benefit, how the process go through, and once they are well educated, they tend to come around and seem way more open to the idea. And And one of the key pieces from this is that the vast majority of immigrants, so I would say, so from statistics, 60% of undocumented immigrants might have a viable living donor. So their family members, their close family members are ready to donate. But obviously because of citizenship status, most of them are not able to. So I've had the cases here in which we have a viable living donor undocumented, but I'm not sure about their follow-up. So sometimes we are not eager to accept those because yes, although the patient is healthy, we are concerned about the potential donors in the future if they are not able to have proper medical care afterwards.
So how do you make that decision?
So for the most part, I ultimately try to steer them through how to get care. So in here up until, I mean, as of now, I know that obviously things might be changing in the country, but taking that into aside, the state of Colorado does offer so far like 12,000 spots a year for medical insurance for anybody, including undocumented citizens. So if I have a case similar to that, I try to steer those patients for them to get insurance so they can actually get proper care after. And I feel like comfortable saying, okay, right now you're a good donor, and then I am comfortable after you have insurance or have established medical care that you can have some for of follow-up after that first year post donation, and you should be okay.
And in the current state, are they usually able to get insurance through that
So
program?
as of now, yes. So obviously the spots for example, the OmniSalud or the initiative, the Colorado State Initiative, should already fill the spots by January 1st before like the change um in policy and in government. So those spots are filled and they're gonna be fulfilled at least for the next year. Things can change, but I don't foresee that changing in our state. So I'm hopeful that that provision will stay in place.
Now, you were part of a workshop looking at this topic, right?
Yes,
Can you tell
ma'am.
us about that workshop and what the point of that workshop was?
So at least I participated in the state initiative, and Dr. Cervantes also spoke, and we were just trying to advocate for our patient population. So the insurance, you had to renew each year, and then you started from zero next year. So my point was like, hey, we are transplanting these patients. If they don't have insurance, they cannot pay their medications, they're gonna lose
The transplant.
their transplant. So they're gonna be back probably worse than they started because they're gonna be sensitized. They're gonna be harder for them to get like a second transplant. Centers might say like, oh, you're non-compliant. So my ask was for to give priority to these patients, and we were successful. And as of this year, all of our transplant patients and patients with chronic disease like cancer as well were given priority and the opportunity to get reinsured without having to wait in the queue in line or risk not getting insurance. The other important, like at least like on a nationwide perspective, which was like the topic that doctors talked about the veil controversies meeting. So it was like a world meeting for different countries, people from the States, from Poland, Colombia, Spain, Australia, Qatar, Lebanon. They all experts in organ transplantation. They met in Argentina in 2022. The meeting was called the Declaration of Istanbul, or Organ Traffic and Transplant Tourism. So that workshop, they try to focus on discussing the vulnerability of these migrant and refugees in terms of trafficking organs, and then the financial coercion that some of them were suffering. They also discuss like the access of care for migrants and refugees, and particularly for those with end-stage organ disease needing transplant and for transplant recipients. And then ultimately, they try to discuss about potential strategies about the fallout of offering transplant to these migrant refugees, taking into account that they were potentially using the resources of available organs to local citizens and try to mitigate that fallout. So overall, so in that workshop, each of the representative from each country gave like a quick overview of what were the status of their country to try to compare. So the big picture of the meeting is that they realized that, yeah, there's a disparate access to transplant service for these migrants, but it was dependent on the resources and access to transplant for care citizen in each region. So regions with greater resources had potentially more willingness to allocate organs to these migrants and refugees compared to others that don't have the resource, but ultimately that willingness was compromised by the natural concerns that the citizens might be negatively impacted because of the scarce resources that we talked about. And then also regions where the access was scarce. And in some places, even the natives were not able to pursue organ transplantation. So in those cases were actually not feasible. The best example and most relevant, I would say, is like the Poland, which was Dr. Jolanta Malisko spoke about. So they received, as of 2022, more than 8 million Ukrainian citizens across the Polish border. So ultimately, like about six more million were able to return, but in Poland, at least 2 million Ukrainian refugees remain. So Poland did something very nice and generous, and they were able to provide like a Polish identification number, which gave them access to the basic drugs and healthcare. And ultimately, the Polish National Health established a fund which helped these patients cover for dialysis service in public and non-public units, and be able to provide reimbursements of renal replacement therapy and transplant for these refugees. So that's quote unquote like a great model about how we should do things. To put in contrast, for example, in Colombia, which you have close to 3 million Venezuelan immigrants, in 2004 there was a law or a decree called number 2493 that made it almost impossible for a foreigner to get a deceased donor transplant, but living organ donation was still permitted. Now the caveat is that if you're able to stay or live there long enough, eventually you would become a legal resident. So of close of the 3 million immigrants from Venezuela to Colombia, after 3 to 4 years, close to 70% of them were legal residents, and they were able to actually enter the local pool for deceased donation. So with that being said, Dr. Murcia, which gave the talk about Colombia, did says that the Colombia was facing like major healthcare reform, and he was not certain that this organ transplantation was going to be able to continue. Other places spoke, like from Lebanon, for example. In Lebanon, there was like from the Syrian civil war in 2011 to multiple other conflicts, made like a disaster or kind of like overall like a pretty bad picture. More than half of the transplant centers closed. They were able to not do as many transplants, and they were doing about 80 transplants per year in terms of across the number. So that's a typical case scenario of things not going well when there's ongoing conflict. Other places like Australia and Qatar, which had decent number of immigrants too, were able to have some provisions. And then another good example was Spain. There also had like a royal decree back in 2018 that provided universal access to the national healthcare system, as long as they were able to live 3 months there, or to prove that they were there in Spain for at least 3 months, they were able to get this health insurance and be able to provide care. So that's another great example of things that can go well.
Great.
You briefly mentioned organ trafficking, and I think for most people that's something they've only heard about like in a bad movie or something. And so can you tell us more about the reality of that and the implications?
So the reality is that at least in third world countries, it's way more common than we would think. And for example, in Lebanon, which is like a humanitarian crisis, we're talking about people that don't have resources to eat and live, and then you have wealthy individuals going to these places to try to buy some organs. So Lebanon went from being called the Switzerland of Middle East to a place where the same Dr. Barbari mentioned that he doesn't see like any any improvement in the foreseeable future. And it's like he called it like hopeless human tragedy. And at least in Lebanon, there was a pretty high propensity of people being taken advantage of and getting paid for organ donation. So it's not about the payment per se, but obviously taking advantage of somebody in need who is donating, which, for example, in the States, that's something unheard of, or something that we're very zealous, and the Living Donor Advocate is looking for that always. But these patients don't have their proper follow-up after donation, and they're taken advantage of. And so it's a
And
pretty sad situation.
very sad. And on the subject of organ trafficking, usually does it take place at some proper medical facility, or it's not even under, yeah.
Yeah, that's another great point. It's not in the cleanest place, or in a place where you should get ever operated on. So another potential risk for that potential donor, in which you are doing a major medical procedure in a place where you should not be dealing with human life and livelihood like that, definitely. So another good point.
Yeah, you might get some money, but then you will end up dying. There's so many complications, so much that can go wrong. It's just terrible. As we were preparing for the podcast, you sent us some research information. I thought it was very interesting when it says that non-citizen organ donors in the United States of America, the number of non-citizen organ donors far exceeds the number of non-citizen recipients. So more people donate organs versus receive. Can you explain? And when you mean non-citizens versus non-documented, that also would be great.
Of course. So to start with, as of 2012, the United Network for Organ Sharing, or UNOS, which is the agency that is in charge of regulating and overseeing transplant in the US. As of 2012, they actually started asking citizenship for all potential organ recipients that were listed in the States, and the classifications were US citizen, non-US citizen, US resident, non-US citizen, non-US resident that traveled for the US for reason other than transplant, and then ultimately non-US citizen, non-US resident that traveled to the US for transplant. And at least the last one, for those who come here for organ transplantation, it's like a different story. It's like a different requirement. They need to put their country of origin, and that's the list of the cases. So, but for the most part, we have citizenship classification since then, and we were able to distinguish if they're US citizens or non-US citizens. So in terms of how many undocumented cases in the US, so based on the organ OPTN, which stands for Organ Procurement and Transplant Network, they did a study back in 2018, and they estimated that approximately 1% of the kidney transplant recipients in the US were non-citizens. And they were composed, most of them, from undocumented immigrants and permanent residents with legal visas, meaning non-US citizen but US resident. So in terms of the waiting list, there was an average of 7% non-US citizens that comprised the waiting list as of 2021. So most importantly, they contribute close to 3.3% at least of the organ pool. So meaning of all the organ donors that we have on the United States, at the very least 3.3% of them are considered non-US US citizens or undocumented citizens. And we think that the number is bigger because there's 10% of organ donors that don't have citizenship status in place.
I thought that's a really high number, 10%.
Yes.
Like we don't know the citizenship status, so we
No.
assume that at least half of them probably also in that
Yes.
category.
When the OPO procurements were asked about why, is that they thought that they were like non-US citizens, and they didn't feel comfortable asking because of fear that people might decide not to donate, or that the actual family of the potential donor would say like, hey, I don't want
Yeah.
I want this.
Yeah.
So yes, we estimate that the percentage of organs that come from non-US citizen is more, but at the very least documented 3.3%. So that's a surplus of organs. If they're taking close to 1% and they're donating close to 4%, they're actually contributing more to the organ pool than they're taking.
And is
I
that
think
both deceased and living donors?
That's on deceased.
Only
that's right.
deceased. Wow.
Yes, on deceased. So yeah, as I said, there's a big chunk of non-US citizens that are willing to donate. We do have multiple cases, but the vast majority are constrained by the lack of insurance and proper follow-up. So if we're able to accept these patients, we even have more donors. So they contribute to both, to the living donor pool and the deceased donor pool, but that statistics are mainly from the deceased donors.
I'm reading this book. It's called The Elephant in the Room. So I'm challenging myself. It's like my experiment, like in every conversation, in every podcast, like what's the elephant in the room and how can I ask that question without being, thrown stones in my face? But, at the American Transplant Foundation, we work with just people of all walks of life from all over the world. And sometimes like we are asked this question. My mom has been waiting for a kidney transplant for 5 years. We are concerned that if it will be easier for undocumented immigrants to get a kidney transplant, like she will never get a transplant. It will be even worse. Like, what would be your response to that?
So my response would be that undocumented citizens will not affect their waiting time or their chances of receiving a transplant. So everybody will have to wait the same in terms of, so the same criteria for somebody waiting. So it's going to be the same, either you're a citizen or a non-US citizen. So with that being said, we have to take it into account that, yeah, there is, like I said, 7% of patients being being on the wait list that are non-US citizens. So you would say like, oh, but that 7% might affect my chance. But if you take into account the removal of those patients on the waiting list, you will also take out those 3.3% of organs that are being donated. So
At least 3 point.
yeah, and it's more. So if you take one, you're going to take the other. So I think that is better if we are allowed for non-US citizens to participate in the organ pool, because they're gonna, yes, take some organs, but they're actually giving more. So it's better for them to participate. So I don't think it takes into effect having non-US citizen on our waiting list just for those reasons. And more importantly, which is a topic that when I discuss it, most of the people are like, what is like one of the other arguments against people like undocumented citizens receiving transplant is that they say like, oh, but if non-citizens don't contribute economically to the system, why should they get access? And there's multiple studies tackling this. But there was a nice study published by Salman, and it was back in 2013 that studied how much immigrants contributed to, for example, the Medicaid Trust Fund. And what we found is actually they contribute more. They have an excess or surplus. So they actually contribute more to the Medicaid Trust Fund than US born people. So they actually leave a surplus, the immigrants, because as many people might not be aware, these immigrants pay taxes. They work and they pay taxes, and most of them are young and healthy, so they actually don't use as much from that Medicare funding. So that explains why they actually have a surplus. So in 2009, the immigrants made close to 15% of the Medicaid Trust Fund contribution, but only accounted for 7% of the expenditures. And that led to a net surplus of close to $14 billion. If you put that in contrast with the US born people, they actually generated a 30 billion deficit. So these immigrants have a surplus. And one of the key points of this study says like, hey, we need policies that restrict, so that help immigrants, because if we keep putting policies that will restrict that immigrant from participating, we might deplete Medicare financial resources. So it's actually better for us to have these people working and pay taxes because they're contributing more, which is something that if you think about it, it's like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Why we should consider these patients in transplant. And another like important point that I find very interesting is that 95% of these undocumented immigrants are working citizens. So we're talking about that the vast majority of them come here to work. And another point that came out is like, oh, and what if the people come here just to get transplant? And that was disproven by also a study from pediatric kidney transplant recipients that showed that on average, patients are here in the state for more than 5 years before they seek medical care for kidney. So they're not moving here because they need a transplant or medical here. They're moving because they're looking for a better life. They're looking for work. They want to be able to provide for their families, and unfortunately, they get sick while being here.
So if someone is an undocumented immigrant and they have kidney problems and they're not connected with healthcare, what would be your general advice, say, across the United States? I know that's hard to answer generally, but
So it's hard. So ideally, I would try to look for some way where we can get insurance. So in the ideal scenario, if you're not able to qualify for some form of like state funded initiative or state funded insurance, I would try to get private insurance, but that's very expensive. But ideally, just try to get some form of insurance to try to get transplanted. So, for example, in here we have the hospital care discount, which we use for patients that we know that don't have insurance and don't qualify for the state approved or the state funded initiative, but we still try to help them out for the same reason, knowing that it's going to be more expensive for the state to keep these patients on dialysis, and it's going to be better for them because they're going to go back to work and contribute to society. So ideally, try to move to a state where you can get provided better care.
As we're talking about like long-term solutions, it's obvious that we need more living donors. What needs to happen that more undocumented living donors are able to step forward, knowing that there are certain guarantees for them in the future if they need medical follow-up, if they have medical complications, that they're not going to be just left alone struggling?
So that's a very complex or hard question to answer. My simplistic answer would be like, we have to do better as a medical community. What can we do to try to help these living donors? Can we try to push for the recipient insurance to cover these patients for longer? Because right now, the recipient's insurance cover you for like basic complications for that first month to a year. But what if we offer coverage for at least 3 years? Or what if we try to legislate for potential living donors? If you're a living donor, then after that you might be able to qualify for Medicare and Medicare. So we have to work through the system with their ongoing resources to make it easier for them to donate. So I think it's not on them, it's on us, like as a medical community, what can we do? And obviously from a simplistic way, that will be one of the things that I would consider, like how can we get these patients better care, and how can we ensure that they have proper follow-up after, which is the main limiting factor that I see right now happening.
Yeah. And as an immigrant, does the cultural barriers, the language barriers, let alone insurance, right? Just like to trying to put this system of really sophisticated US transplant system, it's overwhelming. So I just want to remind everyone that at the American Transplant Foundation, we have an incredible mentorship program that is available in 12 languages. And like that is such a great resource to be connected to someone who can be there and just like explain the basics and then take you like through the journey and help you out with different resources.
That's a great point. Yeah, I think that you guys do a very good job in education and advocating for potential donors, which we need more. So definitely that's a very good point, Anastasia.
And the reason, that our founder, Steve Farber, when he was going through his transplant journey, right next to him, there was this Hispanic family. And he was looking at them like, it's so hard for me. And they have to jump through even all these additional barriers. And that is simply not fair. So that was one of the reasons to even start the American Transplant Foundation 20 years ago.
Which is like a very, very valid point. And that's similar or in line to what we try to do with our Hispanic transplant program. That we're actually trying to expand to to like different cultures as well, like under the same umbrella. So we're hopeful that over the next 3 to 4 years we can roll out as well, and we are doing the same. We're translating all of our educational material in the top 5 language spoken. One of them is Russian in our hospital.
Mhm.
So having this initiative will definitely help our population, our patient population.
And speaking of new initiatives, like are there any research projects or like any new initiatives that you personally excited about?
So yes, so part of our work in terms of investigation and research is trying to prove that these patients do well. So another very good reason, which is in the same line of why we should consider these patients, as like I mentioned, their outcomes are great. So we have pediatric kidney, adult kidney, an adult's heart, liver, and lung. All of these organ recipients have excellent outcome. They have comparable to actually better outcomes in terms of how well that organ does and how long this patient live when compared to the typical US citizen. So one of the ongoing research that we have, that the manuscript is under revision, is tackling the same. We're proving that the Hispanic recipient, irrespectively of the citizenship status, which we included 30% non-US citizen, did better than the typical non-Hispanic white. On that same analysis, we did found that they were more propense to being lost to follow-up. So now we're trying to come up with ideas of how we can improve the post-transplant follow-up on this patient population. Working with Dr. Cervantes, she has also several ongoing projects which I'm trying to help her. The same, trying to improve access to care for these undocumented Hispanic kidney recipients that are looking for dialysis care and transplant care. So we also have like data from like a statewide initiative. This is like something new or something novel. We're used to using like national data like the SRTR, which stands for the Scientific Transplant Recipient Registry. So we have now statewide data that we're trying to compare, and the same, trying to look for what are the cost resources of these patients that are not getting proper care, which similar to what we've talked about, we know that if we provide the appropriate care, it's going to be cheaper for us as a society, and it's going to be better for patients. But we're trying to model the same on a statewide analysis.
Well, you've certainly covered a lot of things today that are, I think, very interesting and eye-opening. Are there other points that you would hope to get across or share with our audience?
So basically, so I think like more or less like in a summary, we know that just try to educate people. For example, like we said, like, hey, why we should consider these patients when they don't contribute. We know that the actual non-citizens provide a surplus to the Medicaid trust fund, and then they provide more money than they take. Same as like the organs, important to say, people say like, why we should include these non-citizens in the organ pool. They actually provide more organs than they take. They have better outcomes, as we said, so it's very so it's not like we're wasting organs away. And we know that these patients are not coming here just to get transplanted. They're coming here to work and be able to be part of like a productive society. So I think those are the main key points that I wanted to drive across today, particularly in the ongoing climate, which again, things might change, but we have very good data stating otherwise, that it's actually better for them to stay, and it's actually very feasible and realistic to get these patients transplanted.
I really appreciate your willingness to talk about a topic that might be difficult and controversial to some, but so important, and really grateful for your time today. So thank you.
Thank you. It was a
Thank you.
pleasure, and thank you for having me.